Okay, so today we're really diving into something different. We talk about global economics a lot on this show, but today we're going hyper-local down to Argentina. But not the usual stuff, not inflation, not debt crises. We're going deeper than that with this idea of societal implosion.
Yeah, implosion.
It's a term coined by these two authors, Leandro Barttolotta and Ignacio Gago. They've got this book out just this year, 2023, called Implosión.
Catchy title, right?
Right, to the point. And that's what's got us hooked.
Right.
Honestly, when I first saw this title, I wasn't sure it'd be our kind of thing, but the ideas here are just too good to pass up.
Absolutely. What grabbed me right away is how these authors are pushing back against that classic image of social unrest, the explosion, protests in the streets, riots, that kind of thing.
Right, uprisings.
Exactly. Big dramatic stuff makes the news.
Oh.
But Barttolotta and Gago, they want us to think about something way more insidious, something simmering beneath the surface of a society that outwardly might look fairly stable.
Right, it's less about a pot boiling over and more like, they say, a cold fire, which is such a weird concept when you think about it.
It is. It's evocative, though, right?
Absolutely. And the whole book is actually written around these really bold axioms, these statements that they just put out there. No need for further proof. Like, one that really stuck with me is, implosion is more like a cold fire. It burns and doesn't need anything external to combust. Just super powerful imagery.
Feeling.
Right. It gets under your skin, like a pressure cooker with no release valve. That feeling.
And that's where their concept of precarity comes in.
Yeah.
Which is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. But they give it a really specific weight.
It's not just about being poor or struggling financially, though. That's definitely part of it.
Right. It's deeper than that.
Yeah.
They're arguing that precarity is the very foundation that this whole implosion is built on.
So we're talking about unstable jobs, housing relationships, that feeling of constantly being on edge, like you're one step away from things falling apart.
Precisely. That constant effort just to stay afloat, never being able to get ahead, always looking over your shoulder.
And that resonates even if you're not in Argentina, right? I mean, look at the gig economy here, the housing crisis in so many cities.
Yeah.
That feeling of, will I be able to make rent next year? That's precarity too, isn't it?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
And it's that chronic uncertainty that Barttolotta and Gago are highlighting. This feeling that eats away at individuals and at society as a whole, from the inside out.
That's like a slow poison.
In a way it is. And they even have a term for the psychological effects of this constant precarity. They call it terror animico, psychic terror.
Wow. Okay, so not just economic hardship, but a kind of spiritual attack almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It gets at the mental and emotional toll of living with this constant uncertainty, this feeling like the rug could be pulled out from under you at any moment.
Okay, so we've got this pressure cooker of precarity, this unease, this psychic terror. What do people actually do in response to that? Like, how do you live with that day in and day out?
Well, that's where they introduce this really fascinating concept. They call it engordamiento, which roughly translates to clamping down or hunkering down. It's about protecting what little you have left.
Right, creating a little bubble of security in the middle of all this chaos.
Exactly. And they illustrate this with a really powerful anecdote in the book about a delivery worker in Buenos Aires who gets his phone stolen.
Which, on the surface might seem like a small thing, but it's not in this context, is it?
Not at all. See, this young man is already working in this incredibly precarious environment. Long hours, informal work, constantly worried about getting robbed, which is a common fear for delivery workers in his area. So he's heading home after a long day, and sure enough, someone steals his phone right off of him.
And it's not just a phone at that point, it's his livelihood.
Exactly. He needs that phone to work, to earn money, to survive.
Right.
And on top of that, he's left with this awful uncertainty. Was he robbed by someone else who's just as desperate, struggling just as much as he is? Or was it someone taking advantage of that desperation? It's a question that lingers long after the encounter.
Right, and that lingering question, that's the psychic terror they're talking about.
Exactly. It gets under your skin. It makes you question everything and everyone around you.
And that story also really illustrates their point about the war on the interior, doesn't it? It's not just Argentina's economic struggles. It's this internal battlefield that this adjust creates, or this austerity creates within families and homes, even inside people's minds.
Absolutely. Because the book highlights that even more than money, what people are craving is tranquilidad. Tranquility. That deep down peace of mind.
Which seems almost impossible to find in that environment.
Right. And that's the tragedy of it all. This implosion. It's eroding that inner peace just as much as it is economic stability.
So we've got this pressure cooker of precarity, this clamping down to safeguard anything that feels even remotely secure, and this deep longing for peace of mind that seems harder and harder to find. Where does it all lead? Like, what are the real-world consequences of this implosion? Is it something we can even measure or quantify?
That's where their book title, Implosion, becomes even more interesting. Because they argue that if we're only paying attention to the big, explosive moments of social unrest, like the protests we were talking about earlier.
Like the stuff that makes the headline.
Exactly. We're missing the point entirely. This implosion, it's not a one-time event. It's the constant background noise of daily life in Argentina.
It's insidious, right? Like it's happening all around you, but not quite loud enough to notice.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they use this incredibly powerful term to describe it, susurros, which means whispers.
Whispers. So it's like this low-level hum of discontent that's always there.
Exactly. These are the subtle signs of the implosion, the things that often slip under the radar, but are incredibly revealing if you know what to listen for.
Okay, so what kind of whispers are we talking about here? Give me an example.
Well, it could be anything from the mother lying awake at night terrified about her children's future to the worker who has to work 2 jobs just to put food on the table. Is the neighbor who's constantly looking over their shoulder afraid of getting mugged?
So everyday anxieties and fears that most people outside of that environment probably wouldn't even think twice about.
Right, exactly. Alone, they might seem small. But when you start to hear these whispers everywhere you go, it paints a very different picture.
It's like those hairline fractures in a bridge, right? You might not notice them at first glance, but they're a warning sign of a much deeper structural problem.
A perfect analogy. And Barttolotta and Gago are suggesting that we need to pay attention to these whispers because they often speak louder and more truthfully than any grand political speech or protest movement.
It's the difference between reading about a problem in a textbook and actually experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly. It gives you a much more nuanced, ground-level understanding of what's really going on.
This all sounds incredibly bleak, though. If this implosion is so deeply ingrained, are there any solutions? Or are we just stuck watching this slow-burn tragedy unfold?
Well, the book itself doesn't exactly offer a roadmap to a solution. It's more of a diagnosis than a prescription.
Which is still incredibly valuable, though, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because sometimes just naming the problem, just shining a light on it, is the most important step.
It's like they're taking those hidden cracks, those whispers, and putting them under a spotlight so we can't pretend they don't exist anymore. But it does kind of beg the question, what happens next? If this implosion goes beyond economics, if it's about this deeply ingrained sense of precarity and its impact on people's lives, what can be done?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that goes far beyond the scope of their book, but it's something we all need to be thinking about. If we accept their premise that precarity is the driving force behind this implosion, then any solution has to address that root cause.
So it's not just about fixing a broken economy, it's about repairing the very fabric of society?
Precisely. It's about creating a society where people feel a sense of security, where they have stability and hope for the future. And that's a much taller order than just tweaking a few economic policies.
Right. It requires a fundamental shift in how we think about social well-being and how we prioritize the needs of all members of society.
Exactly. It's about cultivating a society that's resilient, one that can weather the storms of a rapidly changing world. And that's a challenge not unique to Argentina by any means. It's something that a lot of countries are grappling with right now.
It makes you wonder, are there similar implosions happening in other places in ways that we might not even recognize? Are there whispers in our own societies that we're failing to hear?
That's a question worth pondering, for sure. And it brings to mind one of the most haunting concepts from the book, Muertes por implosion. Deaths by implosion.
Deaths by implosion. That sounds intense.
It is. They're not just talking about physical death here, but the death of the spirit, the crushing of potential, the extinguishing of hope, that inner light that makes life worth living slowly flickering out.
And that's where it gets really real, right? That's something we can all relate to on some level, even if we haven't lived in Argentina, even if we haven't faced that level of economic hardship, that feeling of being crushed by the system, of feeling like your spirit is being worn down by the anxieties of modern life. It's like this universal experience almost.
It is. It really is. And it makes you wonder, what are the coping mechanisms? How do you resist that? How do you protect that inner spark, that hope and potential in a world that often feels designed to grind us down?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And I don't know if Barttolotta and Gago have the answer, but just recognizing the problem, I think, is a huge first step. Just becoming aware of those whispers, both the ones inside us and the ones that are rippling through the world around us.
Absolutely. Because once you see those cracks, once you acknowledge that they're there, you can start to think about how to mend them, how to build something more resilient, more humane, more hopeful.
Exactly. It's not about pretending these problems don't exist. It's about facing them head on. And maybe, just maybe, that's where we find hope, in that shared struggle, in that collective recognition that things need to change.
It's like their book is a wake-up call. It's a challenge to look beyond the surface and really grapple with the complexities of our world.
It is. And it's a reminder that even though Implosion might be about Argentina, the themes that it explores are universal. It's this stark reminder that we're all connected, that the struggles and anxieties of one society often reflect larger global trends.
And that's an important takeaway here, because it's easy to feel isolated in our own struggles. But when we start to see those connections, those shared experiences, it can be strangely empowering.
Right, it's like misery loves company, but in a good way.
Exactly. It's about finding solidarity and shared experience, and maybe that's where we find the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for a better future.
Because we have to keep fighting, right? We can't just give up and let that implosion happen.
Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the most important messages of this book. It's a call to action. It's a plea to pay attention to those whispers of unrest, of discontent, before they become roars, before that simmering implosion becomes a full-blown explosion.
Well said. I think we've all felt that simmering, haven't we? That sense of unease, that feeling like something's got to give.
We have. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to let that pressure build until it explodes? Or are you going to find a way to release it, to channel it into something positive?
That's the challenge before us, isn't it? And it's one that I think we all need to take to heart. So for our listeners out there who are hearing this right now, what's the one thing you really want them to take away from our exploration of implosion?
I think it comes back to those whispers. Pay attention to them. Don't ignore them. Those subtle signs of unrest, of discontent, of fear, they matter. They're trying to tell us something. And if we listen closely enough, we might just learn how to build a better world.
Beautifully put. What a powerful message to end on. So to our listeners, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. It's been real, it's been insightful, and it's definitely given us all a lot to think about. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, keep listening for those whispers.